Okay, hello, welcome all, and thank you for joining us. So the agenda today is fairly um, clear. It is the essentially the root spec. I think everybody here knows each other, so I think we can proceed on without further ado. Um, the focus is really just on the roots specification. Um, I was hoping just to review the changes that have been made to it over the last couple of months. Um, It's been sort of slowly accreting changes. I would like to get this absolutely finalized in the very near future because people are already implementing. Um, so I'm hoping that we can have all comments in by the 15th of November. I've got undertakings from Explore Kent and from the Canal and River Trust to review in the near future. And if everyone else on the call could attempt to do that, that would be great as well. And of course, if there's any concerns that you want to flag up during the course of this call, please do. Now is the time. Um, so I'll just do a walkthrough of things that have changed in the recent past. Um, if you've got the presentation, you should be able to just click on the link there. And I updated the document to reflect everything that's been going on lately. So here's my run through, and please don't hesitate to interrupt if there's anything that causes concern or anything you've got questions about here. Um, the first issue is simply one of naming of what we're actually calling roots. There has been a continual issue over what exactly we call this because of a distinction between the root itself, which would normally be represented using some kind of geotype like GeoJSON or OSM or something like that. And then the information around the root, surrounding the root, things like safety information, guidance, distance, all of the other, what you might call metadata about the root. So to try to steer around that, we changed the name to root metadata briefly, which seemed to cause more confusion rather than less. The current name is now, the current proposed name, I should say, is now root guidance. Essentially on the understanding that what we're modeling with this specification is not so much the geo information itself, although that can be associated with this data, as the kind of information you'd normally find in a route guidebook or a route pamphlet, that sort of thing. Something that guides people through the route and gives them additional information about it rather than just giving them the bare bones. Does that sound acceptable to everyone, or is that not what you were expecting?
I've got concerns semantically about route guidance.
Okay.
It sounds like turn-by-turn directions.
Right, okay.
You know, your route guidance will commence now. I didn't love metadata either. It's this kind of a little bit of a fluffy word, but my first thought on seeing route guidance was that the first thing I think of is turn-by-turn directions. So much as how you experience this would make it obvious that it's not. There is a naming there that I find a bit weird. I'd be interested if anybody else thought the same thing on the call, or if I'm a minority of one.
Well, what about route guide as a noun? Was that no better?
I thought that on the way through might be a little bit better because it was actually Tim's use of the word, like a guidebook about the route is kind of that does imply it's sort of describing it as opposed to taking you through it piece by piece.
Okay, so guidance seems like finer grain or higher resolution directions than a guide does.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Okay. Any other reflections on that, Andy?
I think I see what your thoughts are around the sort of the route guidebook side of things in terms of so I can also see Chris's point about with route guidance sort of leaning itself towards almost step by step of following round the geopath. So perhaps something like root guide might be a bit better. But yeah, I can see the sort of difficulties in trying to get a name for it, which is sort of going towards that sort of information attached to the root rather than sort of focusing on the geo side of things.
Yeah, and I suspect once we start looking at the geo side of things, the relationship between the two might have to be more clearly defined. But for the moment, I think, yeah, what we're modeling is indeed a guidebook kind of thing. Okay, well, I will open this up as an issue on GitHub then, just to see if anyone else has any further comments on it. I certainly don't have any strong preference with regard to root guide or root guidance. So I'll see what people say. We've got seems like two and a half votes, I think, for root guide over guidance right now. So I'll continue to tally those up. Sorry, did somebody want to say something? I got a noise burst there, but I wasn't clear.
Might just be background noise on my side. I'll mute my mute my
Okay,
microphone.
Okay, the next change is a bit more technical. It might help to actually go to the spec briefly. And this is about how we model start and end points or access points generally. The difficulty is that a lot of roots have got multiple points you can join them from and multiple points that you can exit them from. And in fact, it's often ambiguous what a start point and an end point is. If you've got a sort of fairly lengthy path, you can end up starting at one person's endpoint might be another person's start point, and so on and so forth. So it's not entirely clear what to do about that. Originally, the solution proposed was simply to model this fairly loosely as an array. So you just had multiple start and endpoints. You could specify them however you liked. This of course leads to possible difficulties. You could end up with some kind of overlap. You could end up defining start and end points of root segments and so on and so forth. So this had the potential to create a lot of confusion. So the proposal on the table right now is actually to make start point and end point on both roots and root segments a single value, and then to have different start points definable on the root segments themselves. So if you did have a root that had multiple access points that you could start from, you could model that in the root segment itself using a Boolean value is access point. I can't find it on the page here. Let's see. Yes, OpenActive is access point. So if you had a root that had just a single beginning and end point, you would just model that directly at the root level. If you could join at a couple of different points and alternatively exit at a couple of points, you would create two root segments within that root and have start points for each of those segments, and then put is access point to true on both of those segments. Alternatively, if you had quite a lengthy root that had been broken down into a number of segments, and you could only enter at maybe say 3 out of 10 of those, on the 3 that you could enter, you would have, or exit, you could have is access point equals true, and on the rest it would be false. So that way we end up with an unambiguous modeling. The expense is that there's perhaps a little modeling overhead in cases where you only have one root, in fact, defined in your data, but you've got 2 or 3 entrance points. You'd have to create sort of artificial root segments in order to accommodate that. But that seems like a kind of rare edge case compared to the number of times when you actually have lots and lots of segments, only some of which can serve as entry and exit points. Did that summary make sense to everybody, first of all?
It sounds good to me.
I've got a quick naming question on this one, actually. Just this is for my guys. My route knowledge is I'm definitely not at the level of everyone else on this call. So just that up front. However, I did go on a lovely walk around Bath recently with the National Trust site there, the Skywalk. I think on recommendation of someone on this call probably. When we were walking and following the guidance guide that we had printed out from the National Trust website. One thing that, so that's the context, but I might be missing a bunch of stuff. One thing I noticed is that every single point on that route, people were joining and leaving because even though there weren't officially marked kind of access points, as it were, on the route, there were just lots of, you probably know the route, there's lots of numbered points around it. But people were doing all sorts. They were joining, going backwards. They were joining, going forwards. They were doing half of it. And so I guess I wonder is access point, does this kind of implies that you can't access the route unless you're at an access point. And I'm just wondering whether it's possible to join the route, is the words it says there. So if it's not possible to join the route, so by that definition, every point in the Bath route would be an access point. So I was just checking whether that is actually the definition of the access point, or does it mean something like it's possible to more easily join the route here, or here there are facilities with guidance, or I don't know. What is an access point?
Yeah, and it's a bit tricky because I think on that particular Bath example, which I think is a National Trust example, the difference, the ones that are explicitly marked as joining points, it's because there's a car park there, I think. So it's really is accessible by road. I guess the other points were accessible from other trails or something, other parkland.
Yeah, it crisscrosses roads and other things in a bunch of places. So
right, okay, so you could get a variety of joining methods, I suppose.
Well, I mean, practically it's only a 10-minute walk from, or 20-minute from Bath Centre, so people were just kind of ambling out of Bath centrally and then joining at an appropriate place on the ring. So it wasn't like it wasn't in the middle of nowhere.
Right, okay. I wonder. I guess that kind of information, though, if you look a couple of properties down, you'll see that you've got transport note underneath there, as well as short description and description available. So it could be, I suppose, that you might want to, I suppose, nuance the information you give in is access point with further information there.
So I guess what I'm wondering is the answer as simple as we change the wording in the notes in that column from it's whether or not it's possible to join, which evidently in the Bath case is well, it's always possible to join, to something about whether this is a recommended place to join or something. So,
okay, sorry, I see your point. Yeah.
But yeah, look, that's what I'm checking. The statement, the intention of this bit of data is not to say what isn't possible as much as it is to say where we would suggest that you do something, or is it? If it isn't possible, obviously it would be true all the way around Bath. That's what I was trying to understand. What's the value of the data there?
I mean, I suppose with all of this, really, the issue is really whether you're on a kind of, whether you're approaching it in a curated fashion or not. I mean, I suppose you could join at, points that weren't even, waypoints really, a lot of the time. So I suppose to an extent about what your experience is going to be more than physical possibility. If you have to ford a river to get onto the onto the path, I suppose that's, we would typically say that was not accessible, despite the fact that in principle it would be.
Do you think there is a potential for a property of a segment to be open or closed in terms of the ability to join it along its length? So if it's closed, but it's an access point, then you know that that is the access point for it. Whereas if it's open, you're basically saying that, you know, there are access points at any potential access points anywhere along. It's sort of a question whether this is going to be machine interpreted in terms of helping you get onto it quickly or whatever, versus whether it's going to be simply sort of discursive and you can read the notes to see what it really means.
Yeah. It's a tricky one. I do wonder about the feasibility of defining that in a fine-grained way. What constitutes, it's kind of it's a tricky, because of course you often have urban routes defined by things like go jauntly, for instance. So in fact, there's never any point at which you couldn't in principle join it. There's just points at which you're actually guided. I don't know, what thoughts do others have on that? Would it be worth adding, I don't know, it's tricky. I'm not too sure what the terminology would be, because accessibility has got a kind of limited meaning, but is something like, is accessible along length or something like that, something that would be useful on route segments?
Yeah, just thinking about that, it is a tricky one, because I suppose you might want to stay away from saying things like, is this whole segment accessible, just because of what accessibility means. So maybe something more towards, it's hard with the sort of the wording about being able to getting on that sort of section of route without going to an access point almost. Is that what the sort of the thinking is?
Yeah, and I guess this probably applies more to Chris's use case than it would to, say, the National Trust use case typically. I mean, I think with the National Trust, right, I suppose people might happen across halfway through a segment, but I guess they'd be expected to work out for themselves where the guidance provided by the National Trust, picked up, and there's not going to be any sort of dynamic calculation of where you are along the route particularly. Chris's case, I guess ideally there would be.
Sorry, when you mean Chris's case, do you mean because it's machine readable, or?
Yeah, because it's machine readable. Because Chris, if I understand correctly, you'd be hoping to dynamically calculate routes in an ideal world, right? An individual user could have something plotted out for them.
Yeah, I would want to potentially, especially if you think of some of these situations where there's a lot of routes sort of interconnectedly, you'd want to potentially be able to guide someone onto a route without having to take them to a segment start point first, if that was completely unnecessary for them to get to it.
Right. Okay. So it is about that use case.
As you point out, for urban routes, that's often the case. Obviously, for a lot of maintained paths and things, you're actually not supposed to stray far from the path, and so people would, the route owners there would prefer to guide people to known places to get onto them.
Yeah, it interacts a little bit with what the status of the route is. What the access rights and permissions are in the countryside, definitely.
Yes.
Okay, again, I think that's maybe just another issue to open up.
Well, I wonder if whether the answer is that actually, what my comment on what does this mean from a computation, because the point of having Boolean properties and things that are not just text is so that you can use, you can have some machine interpretation. Otherwise, we would just put it all in the big text box. So I kind of I wonder whether actually, with the Bath example I was using, maybe actually they are all access points, and this definition is right. Is it actually possible as an access point, so that as Chris says that kind of holds. And if there's something that's that's like a car park, that's more of a point of interest rather than an access point, or something. I don't know. There seems some distinction between, is it physically possible to join, and is it recommended because we've got a nice little cafe and something else that you can come to and there's a car park?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to a certain extent, it's about how available the data is, in fact, because thinking of, again, that particular bath walk, which a link to which I will put in the notes to this call so people know what we're talking about. But in that particular bath example, I think they're indicated explicitly as such, and they're the only points that are indicated explicitly as starting points for the route, precisely because there's a car park there. So the data about accessibility from other points is simply not there. You know, if you were digitizing that, you just wouldn't have that information. You'd have to go out and manually research it, I guess.
Well, I mean, maybe, but then, you know, there's some routes like those that the guides know pretty well, right? So, I mean, there was a guy who'd worked on that route for like 15 years who was I was chatting to when he was there, or something like that. Anyway, he's got a lot of knowledge about it. Yeah, I agree. So maybe it sounds like that's the car park situation is different. It's not an access point as much as it is a I don't know, whatever the word is. Yeah, and or an access point is a car park and this property is something else.
Yeah, I was just thinking maybe it is a difference between is recommended access point and can be accessed or something like that. Yeah.
But then I mean, like, I guess can't every point be accessed, or is it just, I suppose if there was a point in the middle of nowhere, what's the definition of can be accessed? You can trek across open woodland and get there.
Well, I mean, actually, in point of principle, probably you can't in a lot of cases. That because of access restrictions on land. I mean, I think most rural routes will have one recommended public footpath. And if there's only one that takes you to that point, right, then it's not an access point.
Okay, so that's the definition of access point by this definition, but the car parks in Bath are not that. That makes sense.
If you think of a run along the canal in Camden, there's very specific access points, and the rest of it you cannot access it. So right. You know, you definitely want to model that as segments with access points at the various road junctions and steps down to the canal.
Yes, but not, of course, not every steps down will have a car park, I guess, or accessibility.
No. And I strongly hesitate to recommend being a car park as the main reason to think that something is an access point. We should be encouraging people away from their cars, not towards them.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's down to the individual publishing organization in a sense. But again, I think that moves it towards being a recommendation rather than a kind of condition of physical possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, you can certainly see that they'd want to recommend ones near tube stations, for instance, as points of interest type of access points.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I'll open it up as an issue then, and then just note within that issue the points that have just been raised.
Do you think for the situation where genuinely the start point is the best place to join, a more explicit field name like, you know, start point is access points or something like that, just reinforces that rather than having a segment that is access point as a property, if you see what I mean? It may not be clear which bit of the geotrace the segment's related to is the access point, or whether it has access point, if you see what I mean. Just a thought in terms of naming it so that it's hard to misinterpret.
Although, actually, interestingly, I guess because this is about a guide, all the points are in order, aren't they? There's an ordering to them. So there is a notion of a first point, which I guess could have this access point set to true. Is that sufficient, or?
Right. What Tim was saying was that if there are multiple access points, the route would be divided up into route segments, and each of those has a start point with an access point flag. And
But
if
the
it,
root segments are ordered, is that right? Or have I made this up?
Well,
yes, they are.
they would normally be expected to be ordered, yes.
So there's a first segment which has a start point, which would therefore be the beginning of the root.
Yes, that's correct in the sense that, I mean, I think it's a fairly common convention in guidebooks or in pamphlets that even if there's various points at which you could start, there's one perhaps arbitrarily chosen one that orders the whole thing, and you're expected to compensate when you're reading that if you started at point 5, you know, you start reading from there. That's a fairly common convention. I guess the difficulty is that under this scheme, you do have to, there is a possibility of creating unordered root segments. If you had, say, a walk that, you know, just had 2 access points. Yeah, if you had root data that really was just about the root as a whole, but it had 2 access points, then you would be forced to invent a couple of segments, essentially. I suppose it could be a condition that you also have to arbitrarily number one of them 1 and number one of them 2. That's doesn't seem particularly onerous. But under normal circumstances, yeah, you would have ordered segments.
So I thought that helps or causes more confusion in my question there. So
Did that answer your question?
yes, it did.
Okay, okay.
I don't know if that helps though from what we were just talking about or not.
Right. Well, again, I think it's yeah, it is the distinction, I guess, between whether something's a recommended access point, and then I don't know what word you would use to indicate something that was physically accessible but perhaps not curated particularly. And I then start wondering whether we need an additional attribute to indicate by what mode something is accessible. We've got transport note, which is free text. Although actually, sorry, hold on, come to think of it, I believe the transport note has got more strict definition, so maybe that gets us out of that. Yeah, transport mode is already in there. So that makes sense, actually. You could say, is access point transport note, mode would be foot or something like that, and then you'd have that information represented in a fairly structured way. And then is recommended access point, again, you could indicate if it's recommended for access by what particular means.
Great. As a tangent to that, should we have amenity feature? Is amenity feature? Is that in there already? If it's not, should it be?
That's a good question. I think amenities are given in.
Well, they're actually on places already, so.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, okay. And points, start points, end points, and points of interest are all, yeah.
So it might be worth including those in the table then. I mean, the reason for that specifically is amenity feature, if that's the name of the property from the existing model, includes cafe, car park, lockers, changing rooms, all that stuff.
Right.
So that might be useful to have that.
Sure. Yeah. That makes it clearer exactly why you'd want to join there rather than somewhere else.
Right.
Okay. That seems useful. That seems like if we add an additional attribute for indicating, I guess, curation of the route as opposed to options for joining the route, that sounds like it could do the trick. I will leave. I'll raise it as an issue so we can talk about nomenclature a little bit. But I think, yeah, the general principle of adding, of complicating this part of the specification a little bit, I think makes sense, given the diversity of use cases that we're catering for here. Okay, next bit. Oh, come on. Another one is, so the actual route information itself, the actual geo information. Previously, that was modeled as single values on either geopath, which was to be used for properly geographical data types, file formats, and that kind of thing, and map image, which was to be used for JPEGs, basically. Those have been changed into a somewhat more complex recommendation. In the spec now, both of those are arrays to cater for situations in which more than one map is available. I think the most frequently encountered example is actually elevation maps. So, for instance, Cycling UK has got elevation maps for almost all of the routes and so on and so forth, but it could also be different scales and that kind of thing. The difficulty with that is that you then have to be able to indicate what the nature of the different kinds of maps is, why it is that you're giving more than one URL for your geopaths. So there's now, from schema.org, there's been adapted the map object, which includes precisely that kind of information on it. So yeah, giving the map has become slightly more complex than it was before, simply because the domain is. That's listed in the specification. Let me just go back to that. Let's see here. Yeah, describing section 513.1 is now about describing maps. So the geopath and the map image, which were previously both URLs, now have got slightly different profiles borrowed from schema.org for communicating them. So now, where once there was just a URL, there's a somewhat more complex representation. Does this seem sensible to people on the call?
Looks good to me. Just a very tiny thing that I just noticed is total utter tangent.
Mm-hmm.
In a world where SSL is standard, is it still normal to have insecure HTTP references for items in
No,
your
that's
schema?
a good point. We should definitely pop up those to HTTPS. Yeah, we actually have some specific headaches around our schema.org implementation and SSL. But yeah, we should definitely upgrade those. Yeah.
Okay,
it's worth saying the reason that we have those headaches is because we do have SSL as mandatory. So it's just that's an error rather than we've not thought about it, which is, if that's comforting.
That's good.
I guess the other thing is that there's I think map type should ideally be a controlled vocabulary. Right now, schema.org does have a controlled vocabulary for map types. They don't really relate very well to the kinds of maps that we're dealing with. So any suggestions made as to what kind of value should be appropriate for map type would be very valuable. I just sketched out route map, elevation map, and custom map as three kind of broad catch-alls, but I suspect a more fine-grained representation would be helpful.
As a schema note, I guess either the properties on the right extend the enumeration of map category type that it's in schema as it stands, or we're creating a separate enumeration, in which case we should put the type as either of those enumerations.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
It might be better to do a separate one.
I think so, because the schema.org types are very distinct from the kinds of areas that we're concerned with right now.
Great, yeah. In which case, yeah, we should, yeah, okay. And also minor schema semantics, but it's always capitalized the any classed, including enumeration. So map should be capital M.
Right. Gotcha.
Following on the trend of picking up on minor things on the screen.
No, it's nice to be focusing on minor things. That's quite a resolvable issue. Okay. Okay, so excuse me. The next point is somewhat, I think, somewhat niche. I think ideally this wouldn't concern many publishers, but you do sometimes find use cases in which you have an extremely lengthy kind of route, one that is anticipated to take many days to complete, typically, like the Canterbury pilgrimage, for instance. And then you end up with a kind of triple layer of how route segments are described. So on the top, you'll typically have a description of the route as a whole, saying this takes you from, I don't know, Rye to Canterbury. At the bottom, you'll have individual route segments that will take you to local landmarks along the way. I guess in that case, typically churches, with the idea that you would be walking maybe 2 or 3 hours from church to church. But then you'll have an intermediate layer of representation, which says something like day 2, Sandwich to Canterbury, or something like that. I'm glad that Explore Kent aren't on the line. I expect my Kent geography is not so good, but the point is that you'll tend to chunk the route segments into discrete units over a course of days. Capturing this information is a little bit difficult to my mind because there's typically not very much of it. It's really almost a tag that is associated with each segment along the route, so that, if you had, say, 50 individual route segments, 1 to 10 would be categorized as day 1, 11 to 20 would be day 2, and so on and so forth. One option would be just to remove the restriction that currently exists, which says that there can only be 2 levels of hierarchy in a route guide or route guidance. There can only be the route and route segments. If you said you could have an arbitrary number or 3 levels or whatever, of course, it would be simple to, it would be simple as a matter of specification, just to say, well, do whatever you like there and keep on adding layers depending on how big your route is. I was personally a little shy of that because it seemed to put an undue load on data consumers to then figure out how deep the hierarchy was before they did any further processing. And of course, that kind of recursive structure can be intensive to try to parse your way through. Then there's a question of, can you have irregular hierarchies and so on and so forth. My way of trying to deal with that additional complexity was to define a new attribute called segment groups, and a new object type, route segment group, that is attached to the route. And essentially what this is basically a tag that you can associate with individual segments using their sequence number. Let's see here. So there's the data model down there. Basically, you've got a name, which would be something like day 1. You've got a further description possible if you want to say, I don't know, this will take you from Sandwich to Canterbury. And then an integer array, which simply lists the number of segments that should be, the numbers of the segments that should be associated with that name and description. It's not a terribly neat solution, but I thought it probably was fairly easy to consume, in contrast to other possible approaches. Nick, I remember we talked about this briefly, but I don't think we ever approached a solution. I think we just discussed the problem. Do you have any thoughts to chip in there?
Yeah, I think it's good. Yeah, it's having a kind of potentially infinite hierarchy is a total nightmare. So having a grouping seems like it's the least of the worst things. Mm-hmm. But one note on the modeling of that is that probably we should stick to the JSON LD convention of using ID for referencing types within. So instead of an integer of an array of integer, potentially it should be an array of URL ID URLs, which means that that's effectively the it's potentially slightly more robust. So you'd have to give an ID to all of the segments, I guess, but then you would be able to link them in. But yeah,
I was kind of throwing that around in my mind. I guess I went with integer just because that's closer to how these things tend to be modeled in the published examples. But yeah, as you say, it makes it difficult to refer from outside to those particular segments, definitely.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, I guess we've kind of got JSON LD IDs everywhere, so to break that convention for this is probably it's slightly awkward because you've already got to parse them to link everything else together.
Yeah, right now IDs on root segments are kind of optional unless you're proposing alternatives, in which case you then need to have an ID to specify what you're providing alternative to, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they're optional in the modeling spec unless you're linking stuff together. That's really the only time that you need to have them. But then if you are linking stuff, then that's the...
Yeah, and I suppose grouping is just linking in bulk. So it's not unreasonable to say IDs here.
Yeah. I don't know how else, I mean, without duplicating all the data, I think that's probably... Yeah, seems like a pretty straightforward. Especially as the thing with this is that this is like a very, very edge case, isn't it? Really. So having a whole crazy for like 1% of roots, having a whole crazy structural thing seems like it's an extra lot of work for everyone.
Yeah. The other option, I suppose, would be to define an attribute on root segments called, like label, or I don't know, group label or something like that. But then you'd have to parse everything through, then group, and blah 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 blah. So this puts the burden on the publisher, but it seemed easier conceptually anyway to do it this way.
So is the idea the ID on the root segment is optional unless you're needing to refer to it from something like this? Or did we just go full circle and decide just to do the sequence number after all?
I think the former option was what I understood.
Right.
That we would keep it optional except in cases where you're using it. Yeah. But in this case, you would use IDs rather than integers.
Yeah. Is this the root segment group held as an array on the root guide? Is that how it works?
Yeah, it would be an array of segment groups. Yeah. Okay.
And we're not going to get too hung up on different groups of root segment groups. This is the Canterbury trek for elderly people who can manage a mile every X amount of time, and this is the one for people who want to run it. I don't know. It's just a question whether there's any need for an additional grouping of these groups.
Yeah, because you do get, so if you can have segment alternatives, which you often get in shorter routes, for precisely those kinds of reasons. If you're feeling ambitious, try this. If not, go this way. Might you have an entirely optional stage? Yeah, and I guess...
How are the segment groups currently modeled? Sorry, not segment groups. The alternative routes currently modeled. Is that like a alternative? How do they link together? Right
so you've got an attribute called isAlternative2 on root segments, and then you reference the ID.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
So that's one set. So that's a 1-for-1 swap. You'd swap that segment for the other segment, and then at the end of that segment, you presumably would be. Well, I guess you can't have two segment alternatives in that. Right? You can go left or right as long as whichever way you take ends up at the same point for the next part of the route.
Yeah, the idea is that you'll always be ending up at some equivalent point. Yeah, which is typically what it is. Like you'll have sort of circuit extensions. You'll typically have a shortcut and a circuit extension that takes
So,
to the end.
so in the case where that shortcut skips 3 points.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that. Yes, indeed. Just trying to find.
I'm not sure if that's related to the point that Chris was making, or whether there's something applicable across both things. What I can tell you, if it's helpful, just this is implementation experience from booking and modeling. We made a decision to not allow infinite hierarchies in the modeling spec a year and a half ago, and I am very thankful for that, because the code that you need to write to deal with infinite hierarchies as a consumer is just a total nightmare. When it gets to like the practical, like how do I render this? How do I like do anything useful with it? It's because it doesn't. What it means if you have infinite potential if it's not constrained, then the meaning of each potential grouping becomes more and more ambiguous. So you've got like a sub-event of a sub-event of a sub-event of a sub-event. By the time you're 4 down that hierarchy, like who knows what that sub-event actually is? How do I render it? Everyone's just picked their random data and gone, oh yeah, that fits in like the 4th category of sub-event. I'll just shove it in there. At which point it's basically semantically useless, because you can't do anything useful except case by case, and that's not useful for any kind of scaling of the application. So yeah, it's just reinforcing the thoughts on not having this as like a potentially infinite hierarchy approach. I think is definitely I would support that from that experience. But that's just a tangent.
Sure, although I guess we still have some potential for confusion here. Sorry, looking at alternative route segment guidance. So the alternative paths are modeled as an array. So you could say segment 4 is an alternative to the longer route, which comprises 5, 6, and 7, for instance. Yeah.
You can't have two alternative routes then, can you? Oh, sorry, 3 alternative routes, can you? You only have 2.
Yeah, you can really only have 2 separate alternatives, one of which might be arbitrarily long. But what you couldn't have is, if you take the middle path, it'll be this. If you take the left or the right, it'll be this or this. You could not model that in an unambiguous way under this kind of simple proposal. I suspect that data review in the wild would indicate that is vanishingly rare. But again, it might be that for something like Chris's use case, this is more problematic.
It's the same problem in both places, isn't it? There's the more than one alternative. We've really just modeled one in both cases. Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, the difficulty is I feel like if we split it down further, if we start saying, okay, what if you had 3 alternatives, it then becomes an infinite problem, right? I mean, we're ultimately talking about networks, so you could have, an arbitrary number of alternatives if you're trying to model, say, the entire walking network of Kent or something like that.
Yeah, that's totally true.
So I think probably trying to make it more complicated than the most common use cases is I would think a mistake.
I think you're totally right, because if we, for the 1% case at this point, especially for a version 1 spec that hasn't got that much adoption yet, so no doubt we'll find problems when people come to actually publish their stuff at scale. Seems like keeping it simple might make sense. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, this is based on I asked a few organizations for their most complex cases, And this coped with that. So yeah, I'm sure we'll find other stuff in the wild that does break that assumption, and other use cases that break that assumption. But yeah, I think, again, as you say, at this point, I think it would be a mistake to flag this up as something we have to worry about too much at this point. If it emerges, that's another question. But back to Chris's point about whether we need alternative groupings as well as alternative individual points, I suspect the answer is probably yes. I'd need to look more at longer. I need to look at something kind of crazy like Santiago and that kind of thing to get a sense of that. But I'm sure it must exist out there in the wild. So yeah, I think what I'll do for that is I will also open up that as an issue, and I will do a little bit more research to see if I can find examples of that kind of complexity and grouping being required. Okay, we've got 3 minutes, so I'm just going to go over the last point, the last change to the spec recently, and that is, and I suspect Chris will have views on this as well. One feature of a lot of an increasing number of sites seems to be that you've got user recordings or user contributed content of routes that they've been on. And so sometimes this can take the form of people actually recording literally like step by step where they've been. So you end up with a kind of geo trace of where they've been. Other times it can be further information about the route itself in a kind of curatorial sense. So there's a field been added called user route recording, which is just an array of URLs. So the idea is simply that you can associate additional files with the route itself if those exist. This might be too simple a modeling, but in the first instance, I thought let's just do this as easily as possible.
And I love the idea of being able to link out to user contributed content. I do wonder whether it would be useful to have some idea of the media type at this level, if only to avoid having to trawl, HTTP head on each one to find out what actual file is at the other end of the URL.
Okay.
Because you can certainly see that there might be photos of places on the route. There could be, as you say, the actual recording of their walk or their run or their activity on a GPS tracker. Likewise, could be a video of a section. It could even be, I drew this sketch of how you get from A to B because it wasn't terribly clear. All of the above. So yeah, I think I certainly think I like it a lot, but I just extend it to maybe sort of user media as opposed to recordings, just to remove the potential that there's only certain things you record, and some you don't think of recording a picture or recording a document. But yeah, certainly support it as an idea.
Okay, so maybe just extend that a bit to make it more flexible. Yeah.
And I think elsewhere in schema.org there is stuff to represent, related documents. I can't put my finger on exactly where at the moment, but I'm fairly sure I've seen it.
Okay, can dig around there.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar actually. You could use the creative works, or whatever it's called, the schema.org type, which is what image object inherits from it, and video object does, and document does. So you could make that a type, and then recommend a URL and a content type, as Chris says, to help understand what it is. But you might rather than actually having a content type in terms of the MIME type, you might be okay with just using the relevant type from schema. That's the detail type. So we end up with people using image object and video object and document, which may be more kind of in line with the way schema models other stuff. potentially.
Yeah, that's quite nice. And I mean, to a certain extent, this is going to be at the, yeah, I mean, I think most organizations are going to want to review and curate this stuff fairly intensively. So creative work certainly gives them plenty of scope for how they would, how they would want to treat that.
Yeah, and it'd be quite easy for a consumer to filter on those that they support by just dealing with the types.
Yeah.
We could also formalize, I guess, them later if we wanted to into our own profile. Sounds like it's a bit of an extension point, really.
Yeah.
I have to drop for a 3 o'clock call, guys. I'm afraid. So
thanks for all of your contributions. That was very helpful. I think we made a lot of changes, which is to say a lot of progress. So thanks very much. I will get those up certainly by the end of the week, available for comments. And yeah, thank you. And hopefully we can start actually getting the data published in the near future. Thanks very much.
that'd be great. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Cheers.